Story number 1, Last Ride of 1984. In the fall of 1984, I was a 19-year-old with a reckless streak, thumbing rides across the country. Hitchhiking was a gamble, but it was the only way I could afford to get around, and I had always been lucky, until that night. The highway was empty, just a strip of asphalt cutting through endless miles of forest. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. I had been walking for what felt like hours, the cold seeping into my bones, when a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. I stuck out my thumb, relieved that someone had finally come along. The car, an old, beat-up sedan, slowed to a crawl before stopping beside me. The window rolled down, and a man leaned out, grinning. He looked to be in his 40s, with greasy hair and a weathered face that didn't quite match the smile he was giving me. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Yeah, thanks," I replied, trying to ignore the unease that prickled at the back of my neck. I was cold, tired, and too eager to get off the deserted road to be picky. I climbed into the passenger seat, and the man took off, the car lurching as he pressed the gas pedal a little too hard. The smell of stale cigarettes and something else, something metallic, filled the car. I glanced over at him, but he was focused on the road, his grin still plastered on his face. "Where are you headed?" he asked, though the way he spoke it didn't sound like he really cared. "Just trying to get as far as I can tonight," I said, hoping that vagueness would discourage any more questions. But it didn't. He started asking me all sorts of things: where I was from, who I was traveling with, if anyone knew where I was. The more he asked, the more I regretted getting into his car. I kept my answers short, sensing that he was fishing for something, though I wasn't sure what. The road grew darker, the trees closing in around us, and I realized we hadn't passed another car for miles. The man's questions were growing more personal, more intrusive, and his tone had shifted from casual to something more sinister. "You know," he said after a long stretch of silence, "it's dangerous hitchhiking alone. You never know what kind of people you'll run into." His words hung in the air, thick with implication. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin, my heart starting to pound. I laughed nervously, trying to diffuse the tension. "Yeah, I guess you're right." But he wasn't smiling anymore. His eyes flicked toward me, dark and unreadable. "Sometimes people pick up hitchhikers and they're never seen again." I tried to play it off, but the unease was turning into full-blown fear. My mind raced, looking for an escape, but the highway was empty, and the woods on either side were dense and dark. Suddenly, he turned off the road onto a narrow, unpaved path that cut through the forest. My stomach dropped as the car bumped along the uneven ground, trees looming closer. The realization hit me like a punch. This wasn't some shortcut. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Just taking a detour," he said, but there was a twisted satisfaction in his tone that made my blood run cold. I knew I had to get out, but the car was moving too fast, the woods too thick. The headlights barely pierced the darkness, casting twisted shadows that seemed to reach out like grasping hands. I had to think fast. My eyes darted around the car, searching for anything I could use as a weapon, but the interior was bare, save for a half-empty bottle of whiskey rolling around on the floor. My pulse was pounding in my ears as I fumbled with the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," he said, almost casually, as if he had been waiting for me to try. I was trapped. My breath came in shallow gasps as the car pushed deeper into the woods, the road long behind us. Panic clawed at my chest, and I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the whiskey bottle and swung it at his head with all my strength. The bottle connected with a sickening thud, and he let out a grunt of pain. The car swerved wildly as he lost control, and I seized the opportunity, slamming my elbow into the window until the glass shattered. Ignoring the pain of the shards cutting into my skin, I reached through the broken window and yanked the door open. Without thinking, I threw myself out of the moving car. I hit the ground hard, pain exploding in my shoulder as I rolled down an embankment and into the thick underbrush. Above me, I heard the car screech to a halt, and then the sound of his footsteps crunching through the leaves. He was coming after me. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline drowning out the pain, and took off into the woods. The darkness was disorienting, the trees all looking the same, but I didn't care. I just ran, branches tearing at my clothes, the sound of his pursuit growing closer. My lungs burned, and I knew I couldn't keep running forever. I had to hide. I spotted a thick cluster of bushes and dove into them, trying to quiet my ragged breathing. The footsteps slowed, and I could hear him cursing under his breath, getting closer, searching. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest, praying he wouldn't find me. His footsteps were right behind me now, so close I could see the glint of his shoes through the leaves. He paused just inches from where I was hiding, and I bit down on my lip to keep from screaming. And then, mercifully, he moved on, his footsteps fading into the distance. I waited, not daring to move, until I was sure he was gone. When I finally crawled out from my hiding place, the forest was eerily silent. I had no idea where I was, but I didn't care. I just needed to put as much distance between me and him as possible. It took hours to find my way back to the main road, and by the time I stumbled out of the woods, I was bruised, bloodied, and terrified. I kept walking until I saw a gas station up ahead, its neon lights a beacon in the darkness. The clerk inside gave me a strange look, but I didn't stop to explain. I just used the payphone to call for help. When the police arrived, they searched the area, but the car and the man were gone. I was left with nothing but a lingering sense of dread and the scars to remind me of how close I'd come to disappearing into those woods forever. After that night, I never hitchhiked again. The open road, once full of freedom and adventure, now held only the memory of the man with the dark eyes and twisted smile, and the terror of a ride that nearly became my last. Story number 2, Wrong Car. Warnings about hitchhiking always seemed exaggerated, but as a broke college student desperate to get home for Thanksgiving, I found myself by the roadside, thumb out and backpack slung over my shoulder. The sky was darkening and a chill hinted at the impending night. Eventually, an old, beat-up truck pulled over. The driver, a man in his late 40s with greasy hair and a thin, unsettling smile, gestured for me to hop in. "Where you headed?" he asked as I climbed into the passenger seat. His voice was raspy and his eyes darted nervously as he spoke. "Just heading home for the holidays," I replied, trying to sound cheerful. "Thanks for the ride." "No problem," he said, his smile widening. As we drove, the conversation felt forced and unnatural. The man asked too many personal questions. Where I lived, if I had family waiting for me, if anyone knew I was hitchhiking. Each answer seemed to make him more animated, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. The road grew more desolate, trees pressing in from both sides. We hadn't seen another car for miles when he suddenly turned onto a narrow dirt path. Panic started to creep in. "Hey, this doesn't look like the main road," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Shortcut," he replied without looking at me. "Trust me." My instincts screamed at me to get out of the truck, but the dense forest on either side offered no safe refuge. The truck rattled and bounced along the path, deeper into the woods. I glanced at him and noticed something in his expression had changed. His smile was gone, replaced by a look of cold determination. Then, out of nowhere, the truck screeched to a halt. He turned to me, his eyes now dark and predatory. "Get out," he commanded, his voice devoid of any friendliness. "What? Why?" My heart pounded in my chest. "Just get out," he repeated, reaching over to open my door. Terrified, I scrambled out of the truck, my mind racing with thoughts of what he might do next. He followed, pulling something from behind his seat, a length of rope. "Please," I begged. "I don't have any money. I just want to get home." He said nothing, advancing toward me with the rope. I stumbled backward, tripping over roots and rocks as I tried to put distance between us. The forest was silent, oppressive, and there was no one around to hear me scream. Desperation fueled my movements. I picked up a heavy branch and swung it at him, catching him off guard. He staggered back, giving me just enough time to turn and run. My legs burned as I sprinted through the forest, branches scratching my face and tearing at my clothes. Behind me, I heard his footsteps and his labored breathing. He was close, too close. I pushed myself harder, adrenaline surging through my veins. Ahead, I spotted a faint glimmer of light, maybe a house or a road. I burst into a small clearing and saw a fire lookout tower, its windows aglow with warm light. I didn't stop to think, just ran up the stairs and pounded on the door, shouting for help. The door creaked open, and a park ranger peered out, his eyes widening in shock as he saw me. "Please," I gasped, "someone's trying to kill me." Without a word, he pulled me inside and locked the door. I collapsed on the floor, trembling with fear and exhaustion. Minutes later, we heard the man pounding on the door, shouting obscenities. The ranger handed me a phone, and I dialed 911 with shaking fingers. As I waited for the police to arrive, I looked around the tower, my mind barely able to process what had just happened. When the officers finally arrived, they found the man trying to force his way into the tower. He was arrested on the spot, and I was taken to safety. The experience left me haunted, the memory of his predatory eyes and the terror of that night etched into my mind. I never hitchhiked again, and every Thanksgiving, I give silent thanks for the kindness of a stranger who saved my life that dark, terrifying night. Story number 3, Heartbreak Highway. I was in a daze, barely aware of my surroundings as I walked along the desolate highway. The breakup had left me shattered. We'd been together for 5 years, and now everything felt empty. My mind was foggy with pain, and I wasn't thinking clearly. I just needed to get away from everything, away from the apartment filled with memories. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the road. I knew hitchhiking was a bad idea, but I didn't care. I just needed to feel something else, something other than this hollow ache. So when an old, rusty sedan pulled over and the driver offered me a ride, I climbed in without hesitation. "Where are you headed?" the man asked. He was in his mid-50s with thinning hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Anywhere but here," I muttered, staring out the window. The man chuckled, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "I get it. Rough day?" "You could say that," I replied, my voice cracking. I didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to relive the pain. He didn't press for details, which I was grateful for, but something about him felt off. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking, or the way his smile seemed too wide, too eager. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my emotions were making me see things that weren't there. As darkness fell, he turned onto a narrow, winding road that cut through a dense forest. My gut twisted. "Is this a shortcut?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Something like that," he replied, his tone casual. But there was an edge to it that made my heart race. The trees closed in around us, the road barely visible in the car's weak headlights. The silence was suffocating. I glanced at him and saw his smile had vanished, replaced by an intense, almost predatory look. I knew then that I had made a terrible mistake. "Listen," I said, trying to sound calm. "I think I'd rather just get out here." He ignored me, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. Panic surged through me. I reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Child locks. "Don't be stupid," he said, his voice low and menacing. "We're just getting started." I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I had to think fast. "Please," I begged. "I just need to get home." "I won't tell anyone about this, I swear." He laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound. "Do you really think I believe that?" He reached under his seat and pulled out a length of rope. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I had to get out. Now, I noticed his focus shift to the rope, and in that split second, I launched myself at him, grabbing for the steering wheel. The car swerved wildly, tires screeching as we careened off the road and into the trees. The impact threw us both against our seats. Dazed but desperate, I fumbled with the door again. This time it opened. I tumbled out, scraping my hands and knees on the rough ground. I didn't look back. I just ran, branches slapping against my face and tearing at my clothes as I plunged into the forest. Behind me, I heard him shouting, his footsteps pounding after me. The forest was a labyrinth, but I pushed forward, adrenaline fueling my every step. I could hear him getting closer, his breath ragged, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. My lungs burned, my legs felt like they were on fire, but I forced myself to keep going. I burst through the trees and found myself on another road, dimly lit by the headlights of an approaching car. I waved my arms frantically, screaming for help. The car screeched to a halt and a couple jumped out, their expressions filled with concern. "Please," I gasped, "someone's trying to kill me." They hurried me into their car and sped off, leaving my pursuer behind. I collapsed in the back seat, trembling with fear and exhaustion. The police arrived quickly after the couple called them, but there was no sign of the man or his car. They took my statement and promised to patrol the area, but I knew I wouldn't feel safe for a long time. That night, as I sat in the safety of the couple's home, wrapped in a blanket and sipping hot tea, the reality of what had almost happened hit me. The breakup had seemed like the end of the world, but now I realized how close I had come to a far worse fate. I never hitchhiked again. The memory of those predatory eyes, that twisted smile, and the terror of that night stayed with me, a constant reminder of how quickly things could go wrong.